Moving on now, and free speech is a fundamental liberty that is increasingly said to be in crisis. Does everyone have the same level of freedom to speak openly and notably to be heard? Where is the line, in fact, between free speech and racism? Is free speech racist? To give us his perspective, we're joined by the author of a number of books on those issues, After Charlie Hebdo, which looked at the impact of the Paris attacks, a more recently published Racism and Media, and a forthcoming book entitled Is Free Speech Racist? Senior lecturer at Maynooth University in Ireland, Mr. Gavan Titley, welcome to the show. Can I start by asking you simply that, the title of your latest work, Is Free Speech Racist?
Well, obviously, it's a kind of provocative question, but it comes out of work that I've been doing analysing public debates about racism in Europe and how difficult it has become for people who experience racism, be that racism of the state or racism at the border, or the kinds of racism which still make certain people into the problems to be discussed and debated in societies constantly, in societies of primarily European societies. I've been looking at the ways in which freedom of speech has become caught up in those debates about what is and what isn't racism. So in a way, what I try to look at in that book is two things that strike me as a little curious or paradoxical. One of them is, why is there so much talk about, as you said, free speech crisis at a time when there's never been so much speech? So obviously, in terms of the media ecosystem we have these days, in terms of the very ambivalent opportunities social media provides, people have access to more and more communication. And at the same time, we get more and more controversies over what is allowed to be said and what is free speech. And on the other hand, the other question that I tried to ask is what issues become free speech issues and which issues do not really become free speech issues. Because, of course, in everyday life, speech is curtailed and speech is restricted in a whole variety of different ways. So I was interested in finding out why it is this question of what can be said about racism has become so embroiled in these controversies over freedom of speech.
It is a curious thing because, as you say, we have more and more different media. We have social media in particular, which, on the surface looks like it offers a voice to everyone. But you do go into that question of who actually gets heard on the global platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing, as you pointed out in your introduction, freedom of speech is a very important central democratic right. But it is a right, as you said, that is very unevenly distributed. And the way that we tend to think about freedom of speech and the way that we tend to debate it in publics is very much a very strong liberal sense of freedom of speech, that it's an individual right and it's something where people have the right to be free from coercion. And obviously that's very, very important. But of course, when we think about how speech operates in the everyday, many people do not get to speak in a meaningful platform, do not get to be listened to, and are silenced in various ways, silenced by poverty, silenced by marginalization, silenced by racism and sexism and so forth. So the question, and that question is made much more complex now when we have a media ecosystem where there's a lot of opportunities to speak, but there's a very intensive competition for attention. There's a very intensive competition as to who is listened to and what all of this communication means and for whom.
And of course, you've also pointed out that this idea of free speech is also being manipulated, is being used by a number of different, notably political groups, to get certain messages across.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things which is important to realize about contemporary racisms is that they find all kinds of justification in terms of progressive values, in terms of, for example, standing up for gender equality, standing up for sexual freedom and sexual identities and so forth. Lots of racisms are articulated as defending good things in societies that are otherwise free of racism. And freedom of speech has been caught up in those kinds of political dynamics quite intensively over the last few years. So a lot of the time now we see freedom of speech used as a way of claiming that not just that political actors should be free from criticism and that to be criticized or to have the terms of the debate that you would prefer rejected, that this in some ways it constitutes a restriction of their freedom of speech. But we find freedom of speech being used as a way of bringing back racist ideas and bringing back discredited and defeated ideas into the public realm. So, for example, the debates at the moment around scientific racism and far-right speakers in American universities are very much about using freedom of speech to say, let's just have the debate, let's just bring back these ideas and treat all ideas as equal. And in so doing, what we do is we forget our history. We forget that there's a reason why ideas are not equal, not just because they're not equally credible or equally convincing, but also because they've been defeated politically because of the kinds of consequences that they've had in our world.
That idea that ideas, in fact, are not equal is a very interesting one. And you explain it by saying a lot of, notably the Western world, for a long time, we believed at least, or the general idea was that we were in a post-racial world. I mean, is that now starting to fade away? Are people starting to at least become aware of the reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously a very complex one to get into in a few minutes at this time in the morning. But I think one of the difficulties in talking about racism in public cultures, and one of the difficulties for people who are attempting to talk about their experience of being racialized and experience of racism and the consequences that it has on their lives, is that European societies, in different ways, it's different in different countries, but imagine themselves to be exceptionally free from racism. And that is because since the Second World War, there's a very narrow conception of what racism is, has tended to dominate. And in the rejection of racism as something which is about biology, false science, hierarchies of humanity, of course, societies are against that form of racism, and they're against it institutionally, they're against it in terms of public values. But racism is something historical. Racism is something that keeps changing. The people who are made into the problem population the whole time experience this in different ways that change socially and historically, like everything else in our societies. But what this means is when we have a very narrow conception of what racism is, and when people who experience racism try to talk about that experience, what happens, in fact, is that racism is heard as an accusation. Racism is seen as a way of shutting down freedom of speech. Racism is seen as a way of shutting down telling uncomfortable truths. And this is the kind of rhetoric, these are the kinds of language games which are very, very, very seductive and very powerful for the far right, for the center right, for anti-immigration movements, for anti-Muslim movements in Europe, who are able to position themselves on the side of free speech in this way.
It is a very complicated way of moving to try and think of how one moves forward, because given that racism has a fluid definition, so it's very hard to pin down, and free speech, it sounds like it brings forward debate, but that debate, which it sounds like bringing the most democratic way of finding out various truths, is also so dangerous in so many ways. I mean, one wonders where to find the line.
Yeah, well, I mean, in what I'm looking at, I'm not advocating for particular kinds of restrictions or anything like that. I think that one of the problems with the debate about freedom of speech is that it moves always very quickly around the question of principle. Is something justified or is it not? Is this legitimate free speech or is it not? And in doing that, in always thinking about the legal threshold, in always thinking about restrictions, what we miss, I think, sometimes is to think through the kinds of claims that are made on behalf of what speech is, what speech does, how it contributes democratically, what it means for the circulation of ideas in society and so forth. And I think that one of the things that social media does, and the way that these systems work to basically circulate enormous amounts of content, and to circulate that content in ways that are automated and that don't have necessarily human speakers attached to them, they make us rethink what we really mean by speech in society and what its democratic contribution and value is, and what the contribution of, for example, what its contribution to the life of ideas and so forth is. And I think that that's a good place to be, not necessarily to say that we have to, as is often the case with these debates, to be pro or anti-free speech. I think this is a very reductive way of looking at what's going on, but rather to think about the assumptions that we have about what speech does democratically, who it includes, and who it gives political power to and political opportunity to, and to analyse from that point onwards.
Okay, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. We'll have to leave it there for now, Mr. Gavan Titley. Thanks so much for coming to us and telling us a bit more about the notion of free speech and racism and media. That's where we're going to have to leave it for today's